Well, thank you very much, Ben, and the Free Market Institute for organizing this, and it's truly an honor to be here. I also want to thank you all for taking the time to be here. I'll proceed in a as efficient manner as I can, and we can discuss what it is that you want at the end. There's really three sections to this talk. There's an introductory section where I give some context and background of what I'm talking about. There's the middle part, which is really the heart of it, which is 7 realities of foreign intervention. And then there's a conclusion, and then we'll open it up. So let me get right into it. And I want to kind of give you two background quotes that I'd like you to keep in mind, or two kind of overarching themes. The first one comes from Adam Smith, which of course many of you who are familiar with Adam Smith know for his book, The Wealth of Nations. But this is from his other book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Among other things, Smith kind of made fun of this notion of the man of the system. And the man of the system for Smith is a bureaucrat who is so confident, so enamored, so arrogant about their worldview and their ability to plan the lives of others, that they treat the world as if it's a bunch of passive actors, or Smith puts it as people are simply pieces on a chessboard that can be moved around according to the desires and grand plan of the experts. And so keep this in mind, please, and I'll come back to it throughout. The second, which will make clear the first part of my title, comes from Nobel laureate F.A. Hayek, and it comes from his last book, The Fatal Conceit. And for Hayek, the fatal conceit is the idea that people can shape the world in which they live according to their desires. That is, individuals can use their reason to not only imagine a preferable state of affairs, but actually to bring that state of affairs about. The other thing that Hayek pointed out in this book is that economics places limits on those utopias. That is, while we can imagine many different states of affairs, that doesn't mean we can achieve them. The power of the economic way of thinking is that it illuminates the constraints on our ability to bring about the ends that we desire to bring about. Now keep in mind the subtitle of Hayek's book, which is The Errors of Socialism. Hayek is arguing in this book, as he did in much of his research, about the various issues facing socialist planners who, of course, attempted to rationalize economic planning, that is, use human reason to design and plan and implement that plan to maximize economic wealth while overcoming all these supposed ills of capitalism. The reason I raise this is because as I go through this, what I want to suggest is that foreign intervention, which I'll define in a moment, is much closer to the socialist method than anything that falls under the purview of liberalism in the classical sense. And so hopefully that will become evident as we go throughout. Now let me talk about foreign intervention, which is the second part of my title. I want to take a very broad definition of foreign intervention, and for the purposes of our discussion tonight, the way I want to think about it is as the use of the discretionary power possessed by one government to intervene in another society, to bring about some desired state of affairs. I keep this broad purposefully because I wanted to include a wider range of interventions. Everything from short-term humanitarian aid to longer-term development aid to military intervention. The applicability of the things I will discuss, of course, will vary from context to context. Nonetheless, I hope that you will walk away realizing that the things I mentioned can be applied in various ways to all different types of foreign intervention. Now here's the thing. Treatments of foreign intervention tend to downplay basic economics. And let me illustrate this with a quote from then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton talking to the Council of Foreign Relations. And she basically says we can do whatever we want because we are America. That is, we face no limits to what we can accomplish. Completely unconstrained. This is the anti-economic way of thinking, because of course one of the fundamental lessons of economics is that we all face constraints. What I want to suggest is that this mentality, which, keeping in mind where I started, that is the man of the system, and that's really what this mentality is, neglects economics, and that appreciating economics gets us a long way. So in some sense, my analytical apparatus that I'm going to have in the background of the subsequent points I'm about to raise is very simple and straightforward, which is I want to focus on the knowledge constraints that individuals face. That is, what can and can't we know about the world? What can and can't we design? And then the second aspect of the analytical apparatus I want to employ focuses on incentives. That is, even if we feel confident that we can design what it is that we want to design, are the appropriate incentives in place such that the relevant actors will actually be able to implement the plan in the appropriate manner? In order for an intervention to work, to be successful, both of these requirements have to be met. That is, the requisite knowledge needs to be possessed, and the appropriate incentives need to exist. And so we can pick this up and think through a whole variety of different aspects of different interventions. With that in mind, let me highlight 7 realities of interventions, which very much parallel, as I mentioned earlier, the key errors of socialism that Hayek argued about throughout his career. So I'll highlight each of these kind of conceptually, I'll provide an example of 2, and then move on. The first one, the gap between intentions and results. Treatments of foreign intervention assume good intentions on the part of interveners. In addition to that, they assume that good intentions combined with the right amount of resources can achieve the desired end. So we can picture lots of states of the world that we want to accomplish. They are preferable to the status quo, according to the interveners. And the argument goes that if we just have the right people implement them with the right amount of resources, we can get whatever we want. Again, think about the quote from Secretary of State Clinton. The argument is that we can do whatever we want as long as we put our mind to it, as long as we have enough effort. What does this neglect? Well, among other things, it neglects the wide array of unseen, negative, unintended consequences which tend to emerge when interventions take place into complex systems. Let's go to an example. Libya, Muammar Gaddafi. I think we all can agree that he is a terrible authoritarian despot. Of course, we will put aside for a moment that for a period of time he was considered an ally of the US government. So the argument when Gaddafi starts to engage in attacks against his own people seems straightforward. Overthrow him. On top of that, of course, President Obama said, it's even better than just overthrowing him. We can overthrow him without putting any boots on the ground. All we need to do is enforce a no-fly zone, and that then will lead to his demise, which of course it did. There's one problem, of course. No one seemed to ask a very basic question, which is what happens the day after Gaddafi falls? One possibility, of course, is that a constitutionally constrained government magically falls from the sky and is implemented. An alternative explanation, which seems to be playing out, is that there's a power vacuum resulting in an all-out civil war. So domestically, what we've observed in Libya, following the supposed humanitarian intervention to help Libyan citizens, is a civil war that has imposed significant humanitarian costs on those very civilians. But there's more. Following the collapse of the regime, the rebels who had been Gaddafi's security force left the country and went to Mali and attacked the Malian government, which then required a subsequent humanitarian intervention on the part of the French government in order to quell that attempted coup. Right now, there is a very fragile peace agreement in place requiring external enforcement to prevent a collapse back into conflict. My broader point is this. What appears to be a clear argument for intervention, what on the face of it appears to be an easy improvement to improve the state of the world, is nothing of the sort. Without an appreciation for the possibility of unintended consequences, but also an appreciation for how those unintended consequences will be addressed when and if they do arise, your analysis of foreign intervention is incomplete. The situation in Libya is nicely captured by 2 New York Times headlines, which are a few years apart. In 2011, following the fall of Gaddafi, the Obama administration and others patted themselves on the back. This was supposed to be the new form of intervention. We had jettisoned the Bush-era interventions of military occupation and outright nation building. And instead, the US government was going to adopt a light footprint approach where there was some kind of intervention in terms of support or a no-fly zone, but that was it. Fast forward just a few years later, and now all of a sudden, ISIS is in Libya. So what's the argument now? Well, now the US government needs to intervene subsequently in order to quell the uprising of ISIS. And so you can see how one well-intentioned intervention leads to a subsequent array of issues and problems. Number two, reliance on top-down planning. Interventions are grounded in central planning, just like socialism was. A small group of supposed experts, usually self-proclaimed experts, gets together and designs what they believe to be a preferable state of affairs, typically for an entire society. And they make it sound very simple and neat. Of course, this has some kind of background assumptions that go into this way of thinking. Mainly, it assumes that institutions, that is, the rules of the game which govern social interaction, think political, think social, think economic, think legal, can be designed and implemented as desired. On top of it, these efforts are subsequently linked up with supposed claims by the very same experts that not only can they reconstruct societies, but also they can foster economic development. Again, the claims sound very similar to the socialists, which was, if you allow us to centrally plan economic activity, we too can foster economic development. So these are the most grandiose of grandiose possible claims. Now, if you doubt that people believe this, let's put up some quotes straight from people's mouths or pens. Woodrow Wilson, this is the founding of the League of Nations. For the first time in history, we are going to end world poverty. We're going to bring people together, and we're going to improve the conditions of the working people. Either he was wrong or a jokester. Why? 1949, Truman, 4-point speech. For the first time in history, we possess the knowledge and the skill to relieve suffering. Many people attribute this to the foundation of the modern U.S. foreign aid complex, Truman's 4-point speech. Fast forward to 2000, Millennium Development Goals. Today, we have the financial resources to end extreme poverty once and for all. So at what point do you say, stop saying that? Stop saying that you actually know how to end poverty. Because you either don't, or you do and you're playing a very cruel trick on people that are suffering greatly. What's the issue here? The issue is a knowledge problem on two levels. The first one is that no one knows how to design a free society. A free society, a liberal society, one that respects individuals, one that to the extent government exists is constitutionally constrained, one in which the rule of law exists, that is, no one is above the law, and so on and so forth, is not something that can just simply be created anew. It is not something that can just be written down. If you don't believe me, go through a basic thought experiment. What if instead of spending trillions of dollars on Iraq and Afghanistan, I said the following: look, I live in Northern Virginia, not too far outside of Washington, D.C. I'll take the metro down to the Smithsonian gift shop. I'll splurge to buy the parchment copy of the Constitution. We'll roll it up and we'll send it over to Afghanistan and Iraq. And we'll say, look, it worked well here for, a couple of years. So just read it, follow these rules, and you too can have all the glories of America. Well, hopefully you realize that would be a fool's errand. It wouldn't work. Why? Well, because to the extent that constitutions operate, they reflect an array of underlying beliefs, norms, values, traditions, and so on. You can't just pick up institutions and drop them wherever you want and get the outcomes that you want. But that is precisely what the experts claim to be able to do. They can sit down and design institutions and simply drop them where they want. Related to that, of course, and the second aspect of the knowledge problem is one I've already mentioned. It is the same one that plagued socialism, which is no one can plan economic activity. Economic activity is not something that is centrally planned. Instead, it's not something that's centrally planned if your goal is prosperity. If the goal is prosperity, what we need to rely on is economic freedom. Economic freedom, in turn, allows individuals who all possess dispersed knowledge, specific and unique skills, experiences, and so on, the ability to do what? It gives them the ability to experiment, to innovate, to interact with other people, to benefit from social cooperation, and so on. This, of course, is the foundation of civilization. It is not planned. It is an emergent order. And so when you take these two things into account, hopefully you realize these severe constraints on the ability of people to plan other societies. The disregard for social and historical context. This flows directly out of the assumption that institutions can simply be planned as they are desired by the interveners. What this neglects, of course, is the fact that societies have very complex histories. They have traditions, belief systems, values, and so on that don't necessarily comport with your desired state of affairs. And you say, well, who would be silly enough to intervene in a country without understanding the history? Well, let's go to General, now retired General Stanley McChrystal, who on reflecting on the 10-year anniversary of the occupation of Iraq, said, look, we don't know enough. Me included, we had a very superficial understanding of the history of Afghanistan. All right? So no one bothered to look. No one bothered to say things like, you know, this country's never had a strong national government. Maybe we shouldn't try to construct one anew. There has been violence between groups in this country for significant periods of time. That might be an issue. These things seem important. But let's say you're really busy and you don't have time to read a book. Just go to the New York Times. You just Google it like I did, and it turns out that there's lots of stuff going on. There's something called the Helmand Valley Project, which took place in the 50s and 60s. It is one of the most infamous development projects in the history, modern history of foreign aid. Very few people know about it. But if you actually read about it, the goal of Afghanistan, hearkening back to Smith's Man of the System, was to create Little America in southern Afghanistan, which is where Helmand Valley is, or the Helmand Province. The idea was that at the time, there's no conflict going on at this time in the 50s and 60s in Afghanistan, well-intentioned and well-funded experts can create wealth and development in Afghanistan. How are they going to do it? They send over state-of-the-art equipment, tractors and farming equipment. They move people around, literally. They pick them up and move them. That's not a good place to live. Let me move you over here. And so on. This article talks about it. More specifically, it talks about how it's a comedy of errors, how the key fault was ignoring the human element. That is what we as economists would say, the fact that people respond to incentives. And the article goes on to discuss how the state-of-the-art capital equipment, tractors, fishing equipment, and so on is sitting idle. How the spare parts that are required to make these things operate don't exist. That people lack the skills how to utilize this equipment so that they are unable to mimic their counterparts in America, and so on. Again, if you had looked at this, a massive failure during times of peace, it should have at least raised some red flags to say, well, things might be equally, if not more difficult when there's an ongoing civil war taking place. And it turns out there was. It was much more difficult. The primacy of collectivism. Those that are proponents of foreign intervention, whether they realize it or not, embrace and endorse collectivism on a massive scale. The reason why, of course, is because at the core of interventionism is the nation state. And the nation state intervenes upon other nation states. Pushed by the wayside is any notion of individualism, any notion of individual rights, individual experimentation, and so on. You'll hear lots of talk about needing to pursue the national interest or the global interest, as if that's something that exists outside of individuals. One of the easy ways to know this is when you hear people using the term us, we, them. Got the collectivism going strong. Let's have some examples. Then Secretary General Kofi Annan. We have time to reach the Millennium Development Goals. Who are these magical we that are going to do this? What incentives do they face? What knowledge do they face? So it's that we can do all of these grand things. We can end poverty and so on. This is collectivism. Even worse, U.S. Ambassador Louis Luck talking about Haiti in the wake of the 2010 earthquake. And he says, look, it's terrible, there's a silver lining. We can put it back together the way we've always wanted to. All right? Harken back again to Smith's Man of the System. We, the enlightened ones, can move the pieces on the chessboard, the it, to get the outcome we want. What does the economist say? Wait a second. All the well-intentioned development programs of the past have failed. Why? And what has changed? The burden, the onus is on you, the intervener, to justify or to make a convincing case that something has changed that allows you to achieve the grandest of grand plans, which is to redesign an entire society. Number 5, the endorsement and embrace of authoritarian paternalism. Foreign interventionisms smack of authoritarian paternalism. Why? Well, again, this magical we are assumed to have the power to implement a clear and concise solution. That's authoritarianism. We have the power. We are justified to go around the world and impose our will on others for their own good. That's what authoritarianism is. There's also paternalism. Why? We know how they should live. Ambassador Luck knows how people in Haiti should live because he can put it back together again. One of the manifestations of this mentality is the assumption that somehow when the US and other Western governments intervenes, they are bestowing some kind of gift upon people. And that failure is not the fault of interveners. It is not the fault to appreciate the limits on human reason, perverse incentives, and so on. But it's their fault. They didn't accept our glorious gift. So people say things like, we gave them the chance to be free. We gave them the chance to be a democracy. And they didn't take it. It's their fault. That's one potential way of viewing it. Another is, it is the intervener's fault. They have failed to accomplish the goal they pretend that they actually have accomplished. Another alternative is that the people being intervened upon, that is, I am here to bring you freedom, liberty, and democracy at gunpoint, take it or else, don't want your gift. What you view as good institutions, as a good way of structuring society is not shared. That is a possibility that seriously needs to be considered. The problem with this mentality is it neglects self-awareness, self-reflection, stepping back and saying, we need to have a serious look at ourselves in the mirror and think about what we can and can't accomplish, what has gone wrong in the past and why, and realizing that one possibility, not the only possibility by any means, but one possibility is that we, the interveners, are part of the problem. Number 6, reliance on politics on the most massive of all scales to implement the mission and the goals. So what happens? The well-intentioned experts come up with their plan, their blueprint for fixing other societies. Who implements this plan? A government apparatus of such a massive scale that it's near impossible to actually trace out. Of course, linked up with private businesses that line their pockets through the various government contracts that are offered through these projects. What does this neglect? The standard issues with large-scale government. Waste on a massive scale, mission creep, arrogance. Why? Because government bureaus increase their budget by doing what? Promising more things. Promising that they can do more and greater things if they just have more resources. What else does it neglect? The realities of politics. That politics is characterized by ruthless competition between parties that each want to secure as much of the goodies and money and resources that are made available. It neglects the interest groups that come out of the woodwork in order to secure a slice of the pie. Again, anyone that cares about these things can find plenty of examples. Billions of dollars of waste in Iraq and Afghanistan. Literal money flying around that no one can account for. Haiti, following the 2010 earthquake, billions of dollars unaccounted for. What else do you get when you rely on politics? Massive underestimates of the cost of intervention. Why? Because politicians don't incur the cost. So, some of you may or may not remember, the initial plan for Iraq was this. Quick collapse of the Saddam regime, greeted as liberators, in and out in a couple months, $50 to $60 billion, that was Rumsfeld's estimate, oil will pay for it. You might recall that economic advisor to the Bush administration, Lawrence Lindsay, was fired. He was fired because he had the gall to say, I think 50 to 60 billion is too low. I think 100 to 200 is more accurate. How dare you question our estimate? Get out. To date, Department of Defense spending in Iraq is estimated to be around $800 billion. The Wilson Center, the cost of war project at Brown University, when they take into account long-term costs, that includes healthcare costs for members of the military involved in Iraq. That involves interest on the debt because, of course, Iraq and Afghanistan have largely been debt-financed wars, is closer to $2 trillion. When you take into account Afghanistan and the other wars, secretive wars being waged in Pakistan and so on, it gets up to about $5 trillion. The Food for Peace program. If aid was going to work and help poor people, this would be the case where it would work. The Food for Peace program was initially passed in 1954 under President Eisenhower. It was reformed in the 60s under President Kennedy. It's very straightforward. There's poor people who are starving. The U.S. has excess food. Give the hungry people food. So that's straightforward. So if it's going to work, this is going to be it. There's no grand plan. There's no, we're going to end poverty once and for all. This is it. We're going to give them food. This program is about $1.5 billion. Drop in the bucket for the amount the U.S. government spends on other things. So it should work. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. In fact, there have been bipartisan attempts by both Democratic and Republican administrations to reform the program. And when I say reform the program, you have to understand how this operates. The way the Food for Peace program is set up, it's something called tied or conditional aid. So the aid is given, but it has to be spent in a certain way. That is, it is tied to certain mechanisms of delivery. More specifically, the food needs to be purchased from U.S. farmers and sent to those in need on U.S. registered ships. Now, what's the issue with this? Well, hopefully you realize, if you are starving, and by the way, you live in a society where typically in poor countries, agriculture is what they specialize in, so there is food around, and you have to wait weeks, if not months, to get the food, people die. People are harmed. Yet this persists. The supposed well-intentioned humanitarians who care about their fellow human beings in other countries can't get this aid untied. How can this happen? Well, we don't have to guess. We can go right to the videotape, which is when President Obama tried to get this program reformed, he received a strongly worded letter. From who? The people that are involved in the program, the nonprofits, many of which purport to be humanitarian organizations. And so there's a lot of fluff about national defense, which is just silly because grain has nothing to do with national defense. But the key point's the underlying point. Robust domestic constituency. Give us the resources or else we won't vote for you. That's the logic of special interests right in front of you. That is, this program is simply corporate welfare. It lines the pockets of a few well-connected groups who purport to be humanitarians. Perhaps some of the spillover ends up getting to some people in need, but the program could easily be reformed if people truly cared and people could be made better off. Why is this important? Well, of course, the program's important in itself, but here's what I want you to think about. If something this simple, this straightforward, again, there's no grandiose claims being here about saving the world, ending poverty. If something this simple and straightforward, delivering basic food stuff from here to there, suffers from special interest group problems, what do you think happens when you expand the portfolio of activities? When you say, not only are we going to deliver food, we're going to reform institutions, and we're going to create development, and start business, and create jobs. I would like to suggest that these very problems are magnified significantly. That is, that the logic of special interests grow and expand to a significant degree, such that the very people in need, the very people that are intended to be assisted by the program, end up receiving little to nothing. Now note, of course, they have no voice in the process whatsoever. They can't register their dissatisfaction with U.S. voters. They can't even register their dissatisfaction with U.S. politicians. They're left out of the process. Number 7, the final point, the rejection of complex phenomena. We live in a world of complex systems. A complex system is one where there are interrelated units, and the interrelated units create such a complex chain of consequences that human reason cannot fully grasp it. The issue with complex systems is that when you intervene in one part of it, it has ripple effects in other parts which cannot be anticipated. We can contrast this with what's called a simpler linear system. A simpler linear system is one that can be grasped, it can be mastered using human reason. Technological problems are simpler linear systems. This building is a linear system. Human reason can be utilized to combine resources in a linear manner. You combine resources in a certain manner, and it creates a structure that achieves the desired end. Sending a man to the moon is a linear system. It is an engineering problem that can be solved using human reason. The economy, political institutions, legal institutions, social institutions, these are not simple systems. These are not things that can be designed using human reason. The issue, of course, is that when you try to jam simple system-type reasoning on a complex system, you are bound to generate an array of negative unintended consequences. But remember what is at stake here. This isn't some little game. These are human lives at stake. These are people that are already suffering greatly. And so one of the things that we have to take quite seriously is the idea that well-intentioned, well-funded interventions can do real harm to people. Real harm, significant harm. It can make people that are suffering worse off. In which case, the purported goal of the intervention, which is humanitarian nature, has not just failed, but actually made the situation even worse than it was. There's lots of examples of this. One of them, of course, going back to the quote by Lewis Luck, is Haiti. What's the issue with Haiti? Haiti, another kind of name, informal name for Haiti among humanitarian practitioners, is the Republic of NGOs. The reason why, of course, is because there's something like 10 to 15,000 NGOs, registered NGOs in operation in Haiti, which dole handouts to people, which all might be fine and good except for one thing. People become dependent on handouts, and other institutional arrangements don't emerge because they crowd it out. Governance institutions don't emerge because people don't put pressure on political institutions because they can just rely on NGOs. Well-intentioned humanitarians intervene following a massive, devastating earthquake. Cholera emerges, kills thousands of people, makes hundreds of thousands sick. What happens? The United Nations takes 6 years to admit that they played a role in it. These are unintended consequences that need to be taken into account. You intervene to combat the Soviet Union in the 70s through Afghanistan. You fund freedom fighters and arm them. The Soviets are driven out. The Taliban emerges. That's an unintended consequence you need to think about. You topple the regimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. That results in the emergence of ISIS. That's an unintended consequence you need to think about, and so on and so forth down the line. Here are some specific examples, very clear examples, of an outright rejection of complex phenomena. Number one, this is from the Military Stability Operations Manual. It's the guide for the poor members of the US military that are asked to do things that are impossible to do. They say, the US government says, look, go abroad and don't just get the bad guys, but also rebuild everything. Imagine if you had a business in the United States, all right, a well-functioning business. Let's pick Google. Everyone goes home for the night, the building burns down, so no one's hurt. The firefighters come, put it out. CEO comes up. Oh, since you're here, guys, can you resolve some supply chain issues we're having? Oh, and we have some conflicts with some people that we have contract relations with. Can you resolve those, please? Oh, take a look at these contracts and tell us if they are legally on the up and up. The firefighters would say, I don't know what you're talking about. My comparative advantage is fighting fires. And so the claims that are put, or excuse me, the pressures that are put on members of the military based on a overly aggressive, overly arrogant foreign policy are truly staggering. Just look at this for a moment. I want you to think about this. Someone sat down and said, let's think about democracy. Okay, I'm going to write down 5 words and put an arrow, and that is going to be a recipe for creating democracy. You just get some civic participation, you free up the media, just build some executive institutions and constitutional constraints, get a system of checks and balances and political representation, you get some civil society, mix it together, there you go, you get a stable democracy. You want an economy? No problem. We'll just build the appropriate infrastructure, create a workforce, protect natural resources, build a stock market and capital markets, and then we'll get rid of all black market activity. I don't know what else to say, except for this. This is a declassified set of slides. You might call it How to Build an Entire Society in 22 PowerPoint slides, including the title slide. that someone actually put together. I want you to think about this. Someone sat down and probably hired some consultant from an Ivy League school who's very good at PowerPoint. That's what fancy consultants do. And what did they say? We need to come up with a counterinsurgency plan for Afghanistan. Can you fit that all in one PowerPoint slide? Got it. And here you go. And they say, well, wait a second, Coyne, what are you talking about? This Coyne, not that Coyne. They say, what are you talking about? You said underlying beliefs are important. We wrote down the word culture. We wrote down the word beliefs. You said constitutional constraints were important. We wrote down government capacity. Writing down the words isn't what it's all about. It is the fact that no one can plan a free society. You can't write a society down on a piece of paper. That's not how it operates. But this is the mentality people have. This is the mentality. Go back to Adam Smith. What did Adam Smith say? The man of the system is so enamored with the beauty of his supposed plan that he can suffer no deviations from it. To someone, this was a beautiful plan. Now, what's missing? People. The people are just passive actors. They're the pawns on the chessboard that can be maneuvered and manipulated and moved here and there as we want. So let me conclude and sum up. Here are the key points that I hope that you'll walk away from. Walk away from my talk with. The dominant interventionist mindset, which dominates U.S. foreign policy, which across administrations is a proactive, militaristic foreign policy. That is, the military is viewed as the solution to all the world's problems. That requires a certain type of mentality, and that mentality neglects the basic economic way of thinking. That is, it neglects any consideration of knowledge constraints, and it neglects a discussion of the incentives at work. Now notice, by the way, I've only scratched the surface on incentives. If you truly are serious about thinking through a policy issue in general, but we'll stick with foreign policy since that's what we're talking about, you would have to identify all the relevant parties involved, domestic, in the foreign country, in the surrounding region, in international organizations, in nonprofits, and then think through all of the incentives that those parties face. And so understand the challenge. Do you believe that a group of people in Washington, D.C., and think about Washington, D.C., think about it. Think about your favorite government program. I say that sarcastically. Think about your least favorite government program. Think about what you don't like about it. And then ask yourself, do the same people that operate that program, can they rebuild an entire nation? Can they decide how to intervene in other countries? Then you have to say to yourself, if you say yes to the first step, do these people, along with all the other parties involved, all face the appropriate incentives, and are they all lined up so that that plan is going to be implemented in the desired manner? If you can say yes to both of those things, then that checks the box as a foreign policy that might have a good chance of satisfying or achieving the desired conditions. But if you can't, then it probably doesn't. Now, one thing that always strikes me as I've given these talks is that many people who are extremely skeptical of government domestically, you say healthcare, government can't plan healthcare. Obamacare is terrible, it's socialism. Education, terrible because it's planned by government. Medicare, Medicaid, terrible, so on down the line. You say, what do you think about foreign intervention? Great, let's do it. Doesn't work that way. Which one is it? You can't do the two-step. You can't say government fails at home domestically and then magically, because it steps across an imaginary line that was drawn at some point in time in history, that suddenly the nature of government changes. If anything, what I'd like to suggest is that the problem becomes infinitely more complex, precisely because of the issues that I've touched upon. That's what you need to think about. By the way, if you believe that government can rebuild other nations, you should all, in a way that actually generates prosperity, generates liberalism, then you should strongly advocate for implementing those same policies at home. Because if they do generate all the glories, why are we neglecting them for ourselves? Why would we pass up on these things? So here's the question that some of you might have, that some of you might be thinking about, so I'll head it off. What must we do? And what's the ... Any grandiose plan you want. What must we do to end suffering? What must we do to spread freedom? What must we do to end ISIS? Or whatever else you want to pick. And what I want to suggest is this is the wrong question. It is the wrong question because it assumes that someone is in charge of the world, that someone controls the world. And without that control, there's chaos. It's very similar, of course, going back to my comparison with socialism, the view that someone controls the economy, that someone has to be in charge or it's chaos. But as we know, both conceptually and through empirical evidence, efforts to control the economy through large-scale efforts are devastating in their consequences. In stark contrast, economies work well precisely when individuals are left to their own devices. What I would like to suggest to you, that more often than not in international affairs, the same logic holds. The problem with the myth of the man in charge type reasoning is it leads to an unconstrained way of thinking. It leads back to the Secretary Clinton quote, which is, well, someone has to be in charge. It might as well be us. We are America. We have American exceptionalism. So we can go impose our worldview on others in order to bring control and order to the world. I want you to think about what the implications of that are, both internationally and domestically, if you buy that line of reasoning. So what I want to suggest is that as you think through these issues, and whether you agree with everything or anything that I've said, I do hope that you'll walk away thinking, okay, knowledge constraints and incentives. So now when I face an issue, I hear a politician, I hear a policymaker, I hear another speaker talking about foreign affairs. At least think about, I urge you, these two aspects. What knowledge does it require? What incentives does it require? And are those things both in existence or not? Here's the standard way people think about the world. We need government to do X. Domestically, we need government to provide education, healthcare, welfare, so on and so forth down the line. Internationally, what is government going to do about this, that, and the other thing? That's one set of questions, but I think it's the wrong set of questions, or wrong question. The reason why, of course, is it assumes implicitly that government can do whatever you answer that question. What I want to suggest is the more appropriate starting point is to say, what can government do? The question is, what can government do, not what should government do, right? The standard is, what should they do? And you hear this, by the way, across the political spectrum. Government must do something about this crisis, domestically or internationally, on both the right and the left. They just have different pet projects that they want government to be involved in. What I'm trying to get you to think about, irrespective of your ideology, your political leanings, is to step back and start by saying, what can government do? What can they actually achieve? And you say, okay, I thought about that, and I like it. My guy can do what I want them to do, but the other guy can't, which is how most people think about politics. That's where David Hume comes in. David Hume was the famous Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, and he put forth a maxim. And he said, look, when we're thinking about political rules, let's make the assumption that all men are knaves. Then let's design rules around that. So the right question to ask yourself when you say, what can government do, is not what government do if my person is in charge. That is, you can't have, well, you can, but it's not consistent. You can't have massive war protests when George W. Bush is in office and say he's a war criminal because he engaged in illegal war, and then Obama takes over, and then all the war protesters go away. And they say it's okay because our guy's flying the drones. So the same logic doesn't apply anymore. That's not consistent. And so what I'm trying to get you to think about is, instead of saying, if my person is in charge, I'll get good outcomes, is what happens if the person that you despise the most in politics is in charge? What if they have power and you are granting them significant power, literally a loaded gun of massive proportions? So you better be very sure that the person or people that you support for these to hold that power has both the knowledge and the incentives, assuming your goal is to improve human well-being. And so Hume's maxim does not provide all the answers. I'm not trying to suggest that it does. But it does provide, combined with the economic way of thinking, a very strong framework and apparatus for thinking through these issues and understanding the strengths and weaknesses. Thank you very much.